The tour bus felt smaller than usual that night, too small for all the tension it seemed to hold, for the unspoken weight hanging between two men who should have known their places but found those lines blurring with every session. The hum of the highway beneath them was soft and steady, a muted heartbeat that underscored the charged silence inside the dimly lit cabin. Calvin glanced at the clock on the wall, next to the door, the red digits glowing 9:45 p.m., then back at Dane. Dane was sitting slouched against the faded leather bench, arms loosely crossed over his broad chest, but his bright blue eyes, usually so sharp and defiant on stage, held a vulnerability that caught Calvin off guard every time. It was that look, the one beneath the bravado and restlessness, that pulled at him more than it should have. Dane looked tired, not just jet-lag tired, or from the relentless grind of touring. There was something deeper that wore on him. Calvin exhaled slowly and adjusted the collar of his thin black sweater, suddenly aware of the faint scar above his left eyebrow, a mark he rarely thought about, but now seemed to itch in the quiet. The small, almost imperceptible scar was a reminder that even the most unassuming things had stories, some open, some buried. Maybe Dane's exhausted gaze mirrored that kind of hidden narrative, trapped behind a mask he wore for the band, for the crowd, for himself. "So," Calvin said, voice low but steady, "I think that's all the time we have for today." Dane didn't move immediately. His fingers tapped an irregular rhythm against the vinyl seat, as if wrestling with the impulse to say more, or just retreat into silence, like he often did with strangers or anyone who even remotely smelled of professionalism. On tour, that instinct was a survival tactic. "Yeah," Dane finally replied, his voice rougher than usual. He threw a closed-lipped smile in Calvin's direction, but it faltered. "I guess that's it." The air between them thickened, more loaded with possibilities, and the ache of things left unsaid than with anything remotely clinical. Calvin wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the stillness, but professionalism tugged at his sleeve like a leash, reminding him there were boundaries, rules. Those boundaries were necessary, he knew, for both their sakes. But this night, the soft amber glow of the small overhead light, casting long shadows, the muted street lamps flickering through the small window, made those lines feel less permanent. Calvin could see the telltale signs of Dane's usual armor, slipping just for a second. Eyes softened, shoulders dropped just a little more. He swallowed. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Not here. "Dane?" Calvin began slowly. "You're doing better than last week. I know this isn't easy, but progress doesn't always look like big leaps. Sometimes it's in the small moments." Dane shook his head, cutting off Calvin's reassurance with a quiet laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Small moments. Yeah, I'm more used to the big crashes. You know, one-night stand with disaster kind of thing." His voice was laced with self-deprecating humor, but underneath hovered a raw, aching loneliness. Calvin studied him for a long moment, the hazel warmth in his own eyes, softening despite the internal command to maintain his clinical detachment. It was impossible to ignore the way Dane's restless energy, his restless soul, seemed to pull at something inside Calvin that he hadn't acknowledged before. A quiet yearning he'd buried deep beneath the guise of being the straight therapist, the professional, the observer. The night beyond the bus windows whispered in a hushed lullaby, a tentative promise that this arresting stillness was fragile and fleeting. Calvin cleared his throat quietly, finally pushing himself from the seat he'd been perched on the edge of and reaching instinctively for the door handle. As the first parting words tumbled out, he hesitated an instant, flickering doubt crossing his features, hesitant, reluctant to break the fragile understanding crystallizing between them. "You don't have to hide here, you know." The words floated in the cramped air like a secret shared. Dane looked up sharply, caught off guard despite the soft invitation in Calvin's tone. His lips parted, but no immediate response came. Calvin pulled the door, partially closed, keeping it from clicking shut. The night's cool draft slid through the narrow gap, brushing against his skin like a gentle reminder. a breath of possibility hanging in suspension. Minutes stretched beyond the official end of the session. The bus was quiet, except for the distant murmur of the rest of the crew moving about somewhere else, the faint clinking of a glass, or the low buzz of a muted television. The band's world volume, turned up loud and chaotic, was on pause here, in this tight space, with two men, alone in the fragile seconds after therapy hours. Dane's voice cracked the silence. "Why do you always have to go?" His tone was brittle, drained. "Why can't you just stay a little longer?" Calvin's fingers curled around the doorframe, leaning back so that the grain of the metal creaked beneath his touch. "Because it's not professional," he said firmly, but the edge was softer now, almost pleading. "Because I shouldn't be here beyond the clock." Dane's blue eyes shone bright and unguarded in the dim light. "I'm not some client you just check out on when you clock out, Cal. This," he gestured vaguely around to the cramped bus, to the crackling night beyond the windows. "This thing we have, it's more than that." Calvin's chest tightened, an ache blossoming in the center of him. He'd always known this road was lonely, therapist to touring bands, so many faces, so many stories, none lasting long enough for real connection. Always the observer, the fixer, never the participant. "I feel it too," he admitted in a whisper, voice barely above the soft hum of the road. "More than I should." Dane shifted closer, closing the space between them an inch or two. The faint scent of something smoky and pine from his shampoo mingled with the earthy undertones of the bus upholstery. Calvin inhaled, steadying himself against the unfamiliar surge of warmth blazing beneath his skin. "I'm alone out here," Dane said quietly. "Even with all the people, the noise in that stage, I'm supposed to be this wild, invincible force. But behind the scenes, I'm just me. Scared, exhausted, missing someone I don't even know if I'm allowed to want." His voice trembled slightly, raw and pure, a confession laid bare. Calvin felt his own defenses start to crumble. The professional mask he'd worn for months felt brittle and heavy all at once. He wanted nothing more than to close the gap entirely, to breach the chasm of grief and isolation stretching between them. To offer a safe place where they could simply be. "You don't have to be afraid here," Calvin said, voice low, steady. "You don't have to hide here." Dane's eyes locked onto his, searching, vulnerable and hopeful. For a long heartbeat, they just stayed like that, suspended in an unspoken understanding that neither had dared voice before. Then, with a breath that seemed to steady them both, Dane gave a small, tentative nod. Maybe I won't." And in the stillness, with night folding around them like a whispered secret, the frail threads of trust began their slow weaving, binding two lost souls on the edge of something neither knew how to name, yet both desperately needed. Later that evening, the backstage corridors hummed with the tangled noise of last-minute preparations. Stagehands scrambling over cables, roadies tuning guitars until they sang just right, the muffled thrum of sound checks bleeding through heavy curtains. Against the chaotic pulse of the music world in motion, Calvin unexpectedly found a quiet corner near the exit, away from the commotion but still immersed in its hum. He was unwrapping a granola bar mechanically, senses half anywhere but there, thoughts tangled around the evening's conversation with Dane. The sudden voice startled him out of his reverie. "Hey!" Dane called out, stepping lightly toward him, a grin already tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Would you look at that, Calvin?" the rock band therapist caught mid-snack. Calvin blinked, cheeks flushing just a fraction, then smiled reluctantly, the tension in his shoulders loosening in response. "Snacking is a vital part of surviving tour life," he replied dryly, holding up the granola bar like a trophy. "Vital, right?" Dane chuckled, perching on the edge of a crate nearby. "It's absurd if you really think about it. Me, the lead singer, who's supposed to have this untouchable rock god aura, and you, the therapist. The guy who's here to keep all this chaos from snapping in half. His blue eyes twinkled with mischief, but there was also that raw honesty Calvin had glimpsed, like an invitation wrapped in teasing. Calvin stirred the wrapper between his fingers, the crackle eerily loud in the dim, shadowed space. There's a certain poetry to it, isn't there? The wild, unruly frontman, and the calm, collected shrink walking. This strange middle ground. Yeah, Dane said quietly, gaze dropping for a moment before flicking back up to catch Calvin watching him. Except, I'm pretty sure you hate the idea of the whole shrink thing. You don't seem like someone who'd buy into stereotypes. Calvin's lips curved in a soft smile. I do hate the label. But I also don't mind keeping you in line sometimes. His voice lowered, the playful tone threading through a rare warmth he usually hid beneath layers of detachment. Besides, I'm not above crushing the occasional rock star ego. Dane laughed, the sound rich and spontaneous, and the tension that had built slowly in Calvin's chest started to dissipate. He had to admit, this laugh, this ease between them, was something far more potent than all the professional boundaries he tried so hard to maintain. I guess I deserve it, Dane said with a cocky shrug. But watch out, I'm crawling out from behind the mask a little more every day. You might be in trouble. He nudged Calvin playfully with his shoulder, then paused, his eyes suddenly serious again. Do you ever get tired, Cal, of being the quiet one? Of standing so far back? Calvin swallowed, feeling that heat flare again beneath his skin. Sometimes, he admitted, voice barely more than a murmur, but someone's got to hold the line. Someone like you. Dane's smile softened, sincere now. God, you're impossible. They fell into silence, the air between them heavy with words unsaid and feelings barely sketched at the edges. The backstage cacophony felt distant now, as if they had carved out a tiny, fragile bubble where everything was allowed to be more than just the sum of their jobs and tired labels. Later, when Dane was called for sound check and Calvin slipped away to a shadowed spot near the stage entrance, the quiet anticipation thrummed through him in a way that had nothing to do with professional concern, nothing he was prepared to admit. The lights dimmed, replaced by a muted wash of color that spilled across the stage like spilled paint, and then from the darkness, Dane stepped forward. Calvin's breath caught immediately, but it wasn't the usual clinical observation. No, this was something deeper, more visceral. Dane, under the harsh glare of the spotlight, was unguarded in a way no one backstage ever got to see. His wide blue eyes flickered with something half defiant, half broken, and his voice cut through the silence, raw, ragged edges, bared unapologetically. Calvin's heart hammered hard in his ribs, every line on Dane's face illuminated with honesty. The songs weren't just performances tonight. They were confessions, soaked in vulnerability, stitched together with threads of pain and hope that seemed to unfold in real time. There was a moment when Dane's gaze swept the crowd but caught Calvin's. Instead, just for a second. And it wasn't just the lead singer looking at the therapist. It was a man looking for recognition, for acceptance, for truth, amid the noise and chaos. Calvin felt something shatter inside him, a wall he hadn't known was there, crumbling beneath the weight of that gaze. He leaned forward instinctively, as if drawn closer by invisible threads, the line between observer and participant blurring until he wasn't sure where his own breath ended and Dane's began. The band roared behind Dane's voice, but to Calvin it was silent and holy. The world reduced to that fragile, electric moment suspended in amber light. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was longing and fear. Yet fear felt distant, secondary to the ache in his chest. The impossible pull towards something he'd spent too long denying himself. As the final chord rang out, Dane's expression softened, a tremor of relief, barely hidden in the way his shoulders sagged. Backstage cameras, flashing, buzzing, cell phone fans reaching and calling their idol, they all melted away for Calvin, leaving only the man in front of him. After the last cheer faded and the stage lights dimmed, Calvin found himself rooted in place, reluctant to move, unable to shed the way Dane's voice had dug beneath his carefully laid, professional exterior and touched something raw, unprotected. Calvin's gaze lingered long after the spotlight faded, his mind unraveling in quiet awe and spiraling questions about what came next, if there even was a next, or whether tonight was just another fragment in a fragile, unspoken story that was still writing itself in the dark corners of their lives. The murmur of the bus engine hummed softly beneath the low buzz of quiet conversation. Most of the band had already turned in. The late hours wore heavy on everyone except the restless few who still wandered the narrow corridors of the tour bus, slipping between berths and bunks like ghosts. Calvin found himself leaning against the door frame near the rear, the worn carpet underfoot, rough against his shoes, watching Dane as he settled onto the small couch across from him. The moment when the lights dimmed and the clamour outside dissolved had carved a silence between them, a stillness, heavy, not with the absence of words, but with the weight of unsaid truths. Dane's eyes caught Calvin's, bright and restless, beneath the faint gleam of overhead lighting. "You ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" he asked suddenly, voice low and wary, as if testing the depths of his own question before sending it out to land between them. Calvin swallowed the ache from the day, folding into something more tender, raw. "All the time," he said quietly, "especially here." He gestured vaguely, the tour bus feeling more like a gilded cage than a sanctuary. 1,000 miles from home, with everyone watching, and no one really knowing who you are. Dane nodded slowly, eyes flickering with something like relief that someone else understood. "That's the thing," he said. "People see the stage, the sold-out shows, the screaming fans. But they don't see the parts after the quiet, the loneliness." He ran a hand through his hair, tussling strands in a nervous rhythm. "Fame's this weird fortress, but it isn't safe. Not really. You learn not to get close. Too many people trying to get in, or pull you out. You learn to live in your own silence. Sometimes I think I'm more afraid of people when the crowd's gone than when I'm standing in front of them." The confession hit Calvin like a whispered confession from a stranger's soul, vulnerable and trembling. It was unexpected, raw, nothing like the polished images Dane portrayed beneath the bright lights. The barriers thinned, as if Dane was showing him a crack in the armor only he was allowed to see. "I get that," Calvin admitted. "Sometimes it feels like I'm living behind a double wall, one for the world and one for me. The professional mask, I keep it plastered on, routine and safe. But underneath," he hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't sound like weakness. "I'm so tired of hiding who I am. Tired of pretending that the feelings I have can just be locked away neatly. They keep spilling out in the quiet moments when no one's looking." Dane's gaze softened, the bright blues lighting with empathy and something deeper understanding carved from his own battles. "That's the worst kind of exhaustion, huh? When your own truth feels like a secret, you're too scared to speak aloud." The room between them pulsed with fragile honesty. The usual dance of professionalism, the mental boundaries Calvin kept so rigid during sessions, now slipped like sand through clenched fingers. Here, the dim warmth of the bus's back lounge, there was no clinical detachment. There was no role, but two damaged souls, reaching tentatively for connection. "It's hard," Calvin said, voice small. "I worry about crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. I worry about what it means to want more than what I'm supposed to want." Dane's smile was faint, laced with bittersweet humor. "Yeah. What does it mean when more is maybe not even allowed?" Calvin's breath hitched at the unspoken acknowledgement. The truth simmered between them, dangerous and delicious. "I don't want to lose you to the role you think you have to play," Dane confided softly, "but I don't want to lose myself either." The silence stretched, thick with the promise of a confession they both felt but hadn't dared voice. Calvin's hand twitched, almost reaching out, but retreating as if pulled back by invisible restraint. Then, with a steadier breath, Calvin took a step closer. Closer than either of them had dared before, shrinking the space that professionalism demanded. "Maybe," he whispered. "We don't have to hide here." The words hung between them like a fragile bridge. Dane's laugh was breathy, amused, but hopeful. "Maybe not." And just like that, the air shifted less clinical, more tender. Boundaries began their slow dance of erosion under the weight of mutual recognition. Asterisk, asterisks, asterisks. Later that night, Calvin sat by the small window in his bunk, the road blurring past like a silver thread through darkness. The bus creaked softly, a cradle rocking steady on wheels and miles. He pulled his journal from the small compartment under the seat and opened it to a fresh page, the pen scratching nervously as he poured out the turmoil that churned within. Asterisk. How do you reconcile the part of you that lives for clarity and rules with the part that doesn't just want to bend them, but break them? The ink smearing slightly where his fingers grazed the page. Asterisk. I'm supposed to be the helping hand, the professional observer, the one who can't fall in love with the patient. But what if the lines blur? What if it's already happening? What then? His chest tightened at the thought. The ache he'd been nursing all night now spilled raw on paper. Asterisk. I'm so tired of suppressing this. The desire, the longing, the guilt, they coil inside me like smoke I can't catch or vent out. I'm afraid that giving in means losing everything I've built, the trust, the control. But hiding also means losing myself. Asterisk. He paused, the pen hovering over the lines, as if it were reluctant to finish. Asterisk. Is it courage to hold the chaos at bay, or is real courage in facing it? He closed the journal slowly, the steady breathing of the bus, a reminder of the world still turning, still moving forward, while he felt stuck here between caution and risk. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Meanwhile, in the solitude of his own small room, at the front of the bus, the faint yellow glow from the overhead lamp casting soft shadows across his face, his fingers traced idly over the edges of a worn photograph, an old snapshot of friends, long before the stage lights and crowds and expectations. His thoughts tangled in a knot of denial and longing. He hadn't allowed himself a moment to admit fully how lonely the armor had become, how the walls he raised to protect himself now felt more like a prison. Asterisk. Am I fooling myself by thinking I'm invincible? Asterisk. He wondered, heart thrumming in a slow, steady rhythm that felt almost foreign against the tension beneath his ribs. Asterisk. I'm scared. Scared to let someone in because what if they see all the pieces I've hidden away? What if they don't want the real me? Asterisk. He closed his eyes, willing the ache to quiet itself, but even as he tried to shove it down, the truth gleamed bright and sharp. Asterisk. I want to be seen. I want this, but does that even make sense for someone like me? A quiet breath escaped his lips. To admit such vulnerabilities was an act of bravery on its own, a courage he didn't often afford himself. The stillness around him was a world untouched by the chaos of the day's performances, the relentless energy of the crowd, and the expectations grinding at his mind. Here, alone, he allowed himself to recognize the tenderness nestled beneath the facade of defiance. Asterisk. Maybe asterisk, he thought slowly. Maybe we both need the courage to stop running, to say it out loud, to not be afraid of the love that's waiting in the dark. Asterisk. Outside his door, the muted footsteps of the night echoed softly, a reminder that even in isolation, they were not alone. Inside their separate worlds, both men wrestled with the same wild hope that somewhere beyond the rules, beyond the fear, something fragile and true might be waiting to be claimed. The rain began as a gentle patter against the bus windows, blurred and streaked by the night's relentless drizzle, but it quickly escalated. Thunder growled, low and deep, and sheets of water hammered the metal exterior in a relentless rhythm. Inside the cramped warmth of the moving tour bus, The atmosphere shifted as the lights flickered, once, twice, then died altogether, with a soft groan of the failing generator. Darkness swallowed every corner of the space, save for the faint glow of emergency exit signs that hummed faintly in crimson hues. Calvin and Dane were thrown suddenly into stillness. The hum of electrical cords, the subtle buzzing of screens, even the restless shuffle of the band's crew, everything stalled and gave way to the intimate emptiness of blackness and rain, a drum of nature far louder than anything artificial could ever claim. "Looks like we're stranded in the dark," Dane's voice broke through the quiet, soft, almost awed. The usual bravado he wore on stage seemed tempered, its edges smoothened by fatigue and the sudden thinness of the world around them. He fumbled for a lighter, flicking a small flame into existence. The warm glow revealed Calvin's face more open now, flushed from the residual heat of their conversation earlier, the lines of tension momentarily softened by the unexpected truce the storm forced between them. Calvin caught the flames flicker in his hazel eyes and didn't move away. "We could light a few candles," he offered, his calm voice a steady anchor against the chaos outside. "Might as well make the best of it." Dane nodded, reaching into a nearby drawer where a collection of emergency candles stood. The flame they lit cast long dancing shadows that played across the cramped space, the curve of a shoulder, the angle of a cheekbone, the rough texture of worn leather seats. There was no pretense left, no waiting room filter, or polished professionalism. Just two men, thrust into a pocket of stillness and shadows. For a long minute, they sat side by side, the only sound the rolling storm and their own measured breathing. Then Dane's voice was tentative, almost hesitant. "You ever think about how we get here? Like, not just literally on the road, but—" He trailed off, hands folding in his lap. Calvin turned toward him, curiosity softening the lines around his eyes. "What do you mean?" "That moment when things go wrong but you keep moving, like you're dragging your past behind you because you're scared it'll catch up if you stop walking." Dane's laugh was dry, humor brittle with pain. But there was honesty there, raw and there. Calvin's fingers trembled, just until he clenched his fist still. He wrapped his hands in his lap, like they were trying to hold themselves together. "That's life, isn't it? I've been walking so long, I'm not sure I remember what it feels like to stop." A silence fell thick between them, but Dane ventured on, the mood turning confessional, the candlelight flattering the softness of his voice. "When I was a kid, all anyone ever wanted from me was to be tough. To be loud, to be the one to get them noticed, never the one who cried, never the one who got hurt." Calvin's chest tightened, his thoughts winding back to his own childhood, the long years of silent battles. "I had to be invisible, to be what people needed, without asking for anything in return. You learn to hide the cracks if you want to survive." The storm outside rumbled its agreement as Dane dipped his head, breath catching. "I never told anyone I was scared. Not really. I figured being scared made me weak." His hand twitched toward Calvin's, but stopped halfway, hovering in the dim light. Calvin cleared his throat, his own barriers softening up, brick by brick. "It's not weakness. It's human." He turned slowly and reached out his fingers, brushing Dane's hand, a tentative touch that sent a warmth spreading through the quiet. Neither spoke as their fingers laced together, fingertips exploring the fragile pulse beneath the skin. The storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of storm was stilled. In that darkness, with only candlelight and rain to bear witness, a fragile but profound closeness blossomed. A shared solitude, a mutual understanding that neither had found in a long time. The night slipped quietly between them, folded in whispers and unspoken promises, and when the power finally sputtered back to life, neither moved to untangle the connection they'd formed. The truth, fragile and shining, held them fast. The next evening, the city hummed a restless lullaby beneath their window. The muted roar of distant cars, an occasional siren slicing the night. the buzz of neon signs flickering in rhythm with their pounding hearts. Dane stood near the edge of the dimly lit room, watching Calvin as he spoke softly, his voice a low melody the night seemed to lean in to hear. The weight of the day's rehearsals pressed on them both, a tangible tension that lingered even as they tried to shrug it off, exchange small smiles and quiet jokes. But something had shifted, intricate and undeniable, tangled in the spaces between words. Dane stepped closer, his breath hitching, heart thundering beneath his shirt. The late hour carved a space between them into something sacred, a liminal moment when nothing but truth could settle. Without thinking, he reached out. The gesture was impulsive, a swift, sure movement, born from a tremor of hope he could hardly name, and a desperate need to touch something real. Dane's hand found Calvin's, fingers curling around the familiar lean strength, tentative and electric. He swallowed hard, startled by his own boldness and the quiet acceptance that didn't require explanation. Calvin's gaze met his eyes, wide, unsure, but unclenching, as if waiting for this to be the moment they both knew was coming, but had been too afraid to voice aloud. Neither spoke. There was no need. The silence cracked open between them, spilling something down the cracks like sunlight. The city's hum pressed in softly, a soundtrack to the new rhythm between their bodies, a quiet but undeniable promise weaving itself through clenched fingers and steady breaths. Dane's breath hitched again, heart caught in the sweetness of proximity, and the forever question now answered by a simple touch. In that moment, all the noise of uncertainty fell away, and the world narrowed until it contained nothing but the warmth of Calvin's hand in his, the silence, the steady pulse of something that could no longer be denied. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The final day before the next show held the weight of unspoken confessions, precarious tightrope suspended between what was and what could be. Calvin sat in the familiar chair across from Dane, eyes locked in a tentative truce that carried more urgency than therapy had ever allowed. The professional lines that had cordoned their territory, patient and therapist, twisted and blurred as they spoke, voices dropping softly, mingled with the hum of the bus settling after an exhausting sound check. "I don't know when the line blurred," Calvin admitted quietly, eyes flickering down as if afraid to meet the truth, glowing faintly between them. "I thought I could keep this professional. But every time I see you, every time we talk, I feel like I'm risking more than just my privacy." Dane's fingers tapped nervously on his knee. I felt that too. It's like whatever guard I built around my heart is starting to crumble. Calvin breathed deeply, the weight of the room pressing in, thick with tension and hope. "I don't want to lose what we have. The trust. It's fragile." His voice cracked just the barest bit. "But I don't want to keep pretending either." Dane nodded, courage gathering in his bright blue eyes. "Neither do I. I want more. But I know we have to be careful. I don't want to mess this up." A slow smile curved Calvin's lips, the faint scar above his left eyebrow catching the light. "So, what do? We take it slow." Dane's voice was steady, resolute. "We value the trust we've built. We don't rush. We're honest with each other, and we see where this goes." Their hands found each other again, the grip tighter now, but gentle. An anchor amidst the uncertain sea ahead. It was an agreement, unspoken in rules, but etched in the sincerity of everything they'd shared. The road was unknown, jagged with risks and fears, but the promise woven between their breaths was clear. They would step forward, carefully, together. Morning came with a muted glow, sharp and pale, casting long shadows across the sleeping bus. Dane stood by the doorway, jacket slung over one shoulder, the weight of the impending journey pressing on him. Calvin remained seated, the exhaustion lingering in his posture, but the tenderness alive in his gaze as he watched Dane prepare to leave. "Are you sure you don't want to come with us?" Dane's voice was quiet, wary of the spaces between words. Calvin shook his head slowly, a small smile touching his lips. Not yet. I need to breathe here for a moment longer. His fingers lingered on the armrest, steady and sure. Dane nodded, the faint dimple on his cheek softening as he stepped back inside. The bus began to rumble, engines humming to life, and wheels pushing forward through the early light. The glow of the dashboard illuminated Dane's face as he pulled out his phone. A sudden impulse made him stop, and with trembling hands, he dialed. Calvin answered almost immediately, his voice husky from sleep. "I don't want to hide here anymore," Dane whispered, breath barely audible over the static. Calvin's heart stuttered, and a smile curved his mouth, warm and full of promise. "Neither do I," he said softly. The phone call lingered between them like a bridge across miles and fear, a delicate thing that quivered with quiet hope. This was the beginning, not of an easy path, but of one where honesty carved new shapes out of old pain, where courage could finally find a place to breathe. They were no longer hiding, they were starting to live.